So the first cluster feature that we're going to have a look at is called vSphere DRS, or the Distributed Resource Scheduler. Now the idea behind DRS is to take advantage of the entire aggregate resources of the cluster and use vMotion to ensure that the virtual machines don't end up under contention. That is, as long as there's available resources in the cluster, we'll use vMotion to make sure that no individual VM has to compete with other VMs for those resources. So as a part of this lesson, we're going to look at the features and functions of a DRS cluster. We'll look at how DRS determines how and where to place virtual machines as you power them on a cluster. Okay, we'll then look at how DRS might choose to move a virtual machine from host to host after it's been powered on. And then we'll look at actually how we push buttons and twist knobs. We'll enable DRS in a cluster, and then we'll monitor a vSphere DRS cluster from there. So DRS, as you turn the feature on a cluster, does a couple of really cool things. The first thing it does is it'll make sure that when you power on a virtual machine on the cluster, that is, I have moved my ESXi hosts into the cluster, the virtual machines that are registered with those hosts now become registered to the cluster. I choose to power on a VM, and it really doesn't matter to me on which host that VM gets powered on. As long as it's somewhere among those hosts in the cluster, DRS will choose one of those hosts that is most appropriate for that VM. Probably and hopefully the only decision we have to make about where it belongs is which host can give me all of the resources that a vSphere administrator has allocated to that VM. Make sure there's enough vCPU, make sure there's enough memory, and so on. Okay? That's the initial placement recommendation. Then we'll look at load balancing, ensuring that if too many VMs have been powered on a single ESXi host, or if the load should increase on a single ESXi host because, I don't know, a particular application got really busy, and all of a sudden that individual host is under contention, vSphere DRS will detect that contention or the possibility of that contention and move a virtual machine using vMotion to other hosts in that cluster. Finally, we're going to look at this feature called maintenance mode. When we decide that we want to patch an ESXi host, or we want to take an ESXi host out of service, and that host is in a DRS cluster, we can right-click on the host and select Enter Maintenance Mode. DRS will then take the list of virtual machines that are running on that cluster and use vMotion to migrate those VMs to other hosts in the cluster appropriately, maintaining the balance of the load across that cluster. So those are the major features of DRS. Now, DRS itself in vSphere 7 in particular is very virtual machine focused. That is, it looks not at the idea that we have an even number of virtual machines across all of the hosts, or that all of the hosts are consuming about an equal amount of CPU and memory. No, what it really looks at is, are the virtual machines in the cluster happy? Are the virtual machines getting the resources that they need? Okay. We also have to note as a part of this that the idea or the act of vMotion itself consumes resources. It consumes CPU on the hosts, and it consumes network bandwidth. So the act of doing a vMotion of a virtual machine from one host to another actually has a cost. So DRS is going to look at not only is the virtual machine happy, but is the cost of migrating the virtual machine using vMotion so high that it doesn't really make sense to move it to another particular host in the cluster. Even if I have lots of virtual machines on a single host, and those virtual machines are getting the resources that they need, then why do the migration? It takes all of that into account as it makes decisions on how to place the load of your virtual machines across the cluster. Okay? It does this by calculating what we might consider a happiness score for each of the virtual machines. The higher the score, the happier the VM is, and the least likely or the less likely that virtual machine will be to be migrated across the cluster. So let's have a look at the DRS score, okay? A value of the virtual machine, right? This is a value not of the cluster, okay, but of the VMs across the cluster. So here we can see a cluster score, but it's really taking a look at the individual VMs, not at the hosts, not whether the host is under contention, but whether the VMs on the host are experiencing performance problems because of that contention. It's a very slight distinction, but it's important for us because it ensures that we're not doing unnecessary vMotions. Anything down below, closer to 0% indicates severe contention. Values closer to 100% says, hey, there's very little contention in the environment or no contention in the environment, and everybody is happy. So you're going to see a number of things here. You're going to see breaks every 20%. And the only time likely that we will be migrating virtual machines is if we can move from one level, say from the 40 to 60% level up to the 60 or 80% level, or even the 80 to 100% level. You'll also notice that there might be a list of recommendations that we have for DRS, or are there any errors for DRS? Okay. So we see this DRS score in the summary tab of the cluster, or sorry, in the monitor tab of the cluster when we select vSphere DRS. Here we can view the DRS settings, and here we can view all of the VMs that are on the cluster. So that's the DRS score. You'll note here that when we go to the monitor tab of a cluster, looking at VM DRS score, we can see now all of the VMs that are running in the cluster, and we can see the DRS score. Okay? Here we do have a couple of VMs that it appears that they are experiencing contention. And so DRS at this point has got to be looking at these VMs and the hosts that the VMs are running on and saying, is there a better way for me to organize the VMs across the hosts on the cluster to improve the DRS score of these virtual machines? In vSphere performance charts, we can also add a counter that shows DRS score under the cluster services chart metric. So you can track the DRS score over time and use these charts in your efforts to, for example, procure more hardware if the DRS cluster itself cannot improve the score. Why wouldn't it be able to improve the score? Well, in all likelihood, your entire cluster now has started to experience contention. You've simply got too many virtual machines trying to do too much on too few physical resources. Okay? By tracking the DRS score, you're able to then present that as evidence to whatever organization you work with and say, hey, listen, we need some more physical resources in the environment. When you track this, you'll notice that the DRS score is listed here. It's the latest score. It's not an average of the score over time, but it tracks it here. Okay? You'll notice the latest, the maximum, and the minimum, and as well as the average values, right? The higher, the better in this case. Now, we're going to have in the next video, we'll have a look at the DRS settings. And we'll look at a few things like automation level and migration threshold. That is, how does DRS decide how often and how aggressive to be in the migration of your virtual machines across the hosts? So we'll be right back in part number 2.